that will, you'll see that. If you don't want to be recorded, turn your camera off and or leave the meeting. I'm joined today by several of our translators. I want to say welcome to them first. Our panelists include John Kantarci from Turkey, Igor, and can you say your last name again, Igor? I'm sorry.
Sure, it's okay. Zvijanovic.
Zvijanovic.
There you go.
Ulrich Blumenbach, Moeen Faroki, and Vasco Menzies. Also helping me out today is our president of the International David Foster Wallace Society, Andrea Sheridan. Thank you for helping me run the Zoom. The way this panel is going to work is going to be more like a round robin, a round table. So I'm going to start with each of the translators and ask them a few questions, and we're going to go around the table. If there's time at the end, I have a few questions for them after that round, and then we will come back and open it up to the floor so you can unmute or ask a question in the chat and I can ask it for you. Until that portion of the meeting, we would ask that you remain on mute. As a reminder, this is being recorded and will be posted on our website and our YouTube. I want to start out with a little bit of more in-depth introduction into our translators, and the basic questions I have for them are twofold. One is, how did you discover David Foster Wallace? And two, what was your process in coming to be the translator of Infinite Jest? So just those two kind of questions. Ulrich, I would like to start with you because I believe your translation was published first. This is the book Und Endlicher Spaß, came out in 2009, right? So why don't you tell us your journey, how you discovered Wallace and how you ended up becoming his translator?
Well, thanks first for initiating this whole thing and inviting us all to talk about that, our translations. How I discovered Wallace is actually not via Infinite Jest, but a story from the title story from A Girl with Curious Hair, which was immediately mind-blowing because of this utter distinction between the distinguished voice on the one hand, and after a while you discover that you're dealing with a completely deranged mind, and this double-codedness or double-voicedness was mind-blowing to me. The rest of the story, in my case, is actually very easy because I was offered Infinite Jest by the publishers. They had never worked with me before. I had never done such a thick book before, but all the other usual suspects among German translators who usually do thick books like that, Don DeLillo's Underworld and things, were either busy or didn't want to disappear from their markets and lose the other authors. So, well, I was stuck with it. I couldn't believe I could ever do it. So I asked the publisher to hand in a very long trial translation, I think we call it in German. So it wasn't paid yet. I offered them a sample to A, see how I could deal with the book myself, and B, whether they were content with the way I translated it. That's it for now.
Okay, that's great. And I'm going to come back to you because I have some questions about after your book was published, how that went in Germany. We should say, I should ask each of you where you're at today, because even though you're the German translator, you're coming us today from Basel.
Yeah, right. I live in Switzerland. I am German. I work for a German publisher, but I live in Switzerland. Yes.
Right. Okay, great. And then Igor, let's go next to you. And can you talk about those same two questions, how you discovered Wallace? First of all, tell us where you're at today. And then, what was your process in becoming his translator?
Well, I'm at home in Novi Sad, and yeah, I didn't change place where I live.
In Serbia, right?
Yeah, in Serbia, of course. And yeah, I live in the city, which is in north of Serbia. I discovered Wallace through the story Forever Overhead, actually. That was the first thing I read, and my reaction was pretty similar to Ulrich's. It was mind-blowing, obviously, and after that, through a friend of mine who later collaborated with me, who was one of the editors on the Infinite Jest, his name is Alan Besic. He was he had this connection with the publishing house we both worked for, and we had this idea that something by Wallace should be published here, and we started with two short story books, and those are the first things that I translated. So it's Girl with a Curious Hair and Brief Interviews. Later on, I also translated the Consider the Lobster, and and then it was years of nothing. I mean, we were pushing, both of us, we were pushing for Infinite Jest, but no publisher was willing to, undertake this project. It was just too big and too expensive for everyone here. And eventually, just randomly, after a few years, I got a call from this Belgrade publisher who wanted to do it. And actually, I think the rights were bought from another publishing house, but their translator or the whole project, they just gave up on it. And Contrast from Belgrade, they just overtook that project, and they contacted me because I had translated those 3 other books, and that's how I became the translator of Infinite Jest.
This is the book, and it came out this year. You want to tell us the title in Serbian?
Yeah, the title is pronounced as Beskrajna Lakrdija, which is as Infinite Jest is a direct quote from Hamlet. This is from the translation of Hamlet in Serbian. So I use that phrase because it was only logical in my view of things.
And it just published this year, right? Correct?
Actually, yeah. I think it's almost a year. I think since it came out, or a bit more. And yeah, I think we have some good feedback about how the book is doing, and I'm pretty happy how it went.
Okay, great. I want to go to Vasco next, because your book also has been out for a while. Some of the translators we have here today, their books are still in process or not published yet. But Vasco, can you give us your background, where you're at today, and how you discovered Wallace, when your book came out, all of that?
Okay. So like I said, I'm in Lisbon, where I live, and thanks again for the invitation. And I actually was kind of strange because when I found out about David Foster Wallace, it was through like a newspaper article written by a friend of mine who's also an author, and he was basically exhorting Portuguese publishers to publish or translate something of Wallace's, because there wasn't anything yet. So I didn't know about him. I found out that he wasn't really well known in Portugal then, and then I found out that there were quite a few specialists or experts that ended up wanting to translate it. But I guess it fell on my hands, I guess, with my father, Salvato Menezes, who's also a translator, of course, more experienced than me in terms of all these translations. But we had it was quite a bit strange, because the publisher had like a fixed date that they wanted to. This was 2012, so over 10 years ago now, and they wanted the book to be ready for Christmas that year. I think we started like in February, so we had like 6 months, which is completely I guess it was the most daunting experience so far in translation, and it's also, of course, was really difficult. But since we were 2, I guess it kind of increased the difficultness of it, because we have, of course, different styles, and we had a lot of back and forth between the both of us, because I think it kind of worked well, because my father is more like classically trained, and I was more into the pop culture references in Infinite Jest, I guess. So it was like a good mix. But we've been trying to get the publisher to give us another shot to republish it, because we know that we can tweak it a little bit and make it better, because it was really just not that much time to do it. And I actually ended up translating some of his essays afterwards, and also with my mom, so it kind of runs in the family. She's also a translator. And then did the last Wallace thing that I did was Pale King, in I guess 10 years ago. So also it's between 2012 and 2014. I kind of did all of that. I lived with Foster Wallace for 2 years, I guess. So I'm still recovering a bit from that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. And I hope that you do feel better. You said you have a bit of a cold today. So
yeah, I'm feeling better.
I want to go to Moeen next, who is, I believe, in Tehran. Are you in Tehran today?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And your book, I should say, is done, but comes out in a few weeks, right? Like it's.
Yeah, in I think 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay, great. So tell us, how did you discover David Foster Wallace? What was your experience, as getting the translation rights, and then also, just how is that in the censorship process in Iran as well?
Oh, it will take time. Actually, I stumbled on Wallace somewhat accidentally. I was a translation editor in a literary magazine in Iran. And of course, I heard about Wallace as this giant, white, hyped American writer, but I wasn't so keen to read him. But a friend of mine actually had read Boom of the System, and he was blown away by it. And he strongly recommended him to me for publishing it in the magazine. And basically, I started Googling him and reading his stories on New Yorker. And my first experience of reading Wallace was the story All That in the New Yorker, which I bet it's not the best way to start Wallace. But that was my initial experience, and obviously I was blown away too. Then I translated some of his essays and stories and pushed the publishers and magazines to publish it, but they were not so keen on it because they thought it's too complicated for Iranian literature escape. But what changed the situation was the publishing of his essays, Consider the Lobsters, and it was a small book of 4 essays actually, and it gained some reputation, and it turned out that readers, unlike editors, are willing to read Wallace, are willing to discover new realms in the literature, are willing to read with more focused. And after that, I translated Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. Iran don't obey the copyright rules. So we hadn't any problems with these books. But with Infinite Jest, we decided to go for copyright. And the agent, the Nadal agency, was like that we don't like to work with Iran. It can cause us a lot of headaches and so on. But we insisted, and actually we end up gaining the copyright. And that's it about the censorship you asked. Yeah.
Okay, great. I just find it very interesting that Wallace found, a readership there. And I have some more questions for you about that, but we're going to move on now to John. I want to get your take on this. Also tell us, where you are today, how you discovered Wallace, and, how you came to work on his translation and the status of it.
Hello again. I'm in Istanbul right now. I've been living on and off in Istanbul since 1992, and I've been translating Infinite Jest since 2021. And the first Wallace I read was Suppose the Fun Thing I Will Never Do Again when I was in the US doing my master's degree at University of Missouri, Columbia. And when I came back to Istanbul for the winter break, I found out that This Is Water was translated by a publishing house. I went to them. This was like 10 years ago and 12 years ago, actually, and we couldn't agree terms because basically I asked for like infinite time and they didn't give me that. And then I forgot about it basically. I mean, I read the book. It was kind of like this holy grail for me and waiting there. And I did other translations in the meanwhile. I translated Alan Moore's Watchmen, like William Gibson's Neuromancer, stuff like that. And then in 2020, my debut novel came out from a publishing house. And when we were like talking, like it was the first day of the publishing, I think, something like that. He said, you've been doing translations for a while. Would you like to do a translation for us apart from publishing your own stuff? And I said, like, I would love to. Like, what do you have something in mind? He said, like, do you have something in mind? And I said, like, what about David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest? Like, who has the rights to it, you know? He said that, like, no one has the rights right now. And, like, the book is looking for someone brave to do it in Turkey. And I said, like, I can't say I'm brave, but if you give me enough time, I can be brave enough to do it, you know? And then they said they wrote to the agency who has rights. And then I told them I'm gonna need like 5 years, and they said, "Okay, I'm lying." I said like I'm gonna need 2 years. So because if I said 5 years at first, they wouldn't have accepted it, you know. So I said 2 years, and after 4 months later, I said this is gonna take like 5 years, you know. So then they said okay, but I explained the situation to them. So I basically told them that like I'm working like 9 to 6. I have a kid, but I'm gonna be translating this continuously, you know, like 1 page a day, not in the weekends, but during the weekdays, and it's gonna take me 5 years. So it's been like 3 years now, and I finished like 655 pages, another 350 left, give or take. So yeah.
Okay, great. So keep working 1 page a day, and we'll get there. And last but certainly not least, I want to ask Costas the same questions. How did you discover Wallace? How did you get into translating Infinite Jest? And where are you joining us from today?
So I'm back in Athens. I was in Southampton in the UK for quite a while, but now I'm just back here. Anyway, so Wallace. So it was like 1997. I walked into the Waterstones in Leicester, not Leicester Square in London, Leicester, the city. And they had like those new and paperback displays, and like Infinite Jest was right in front. And I took one look at the size of it, and I went, "Oh, that's definitely the book for me, right?" And then right at the back cover, I was like, "It's definitely the book for me." I just couldn't afford to buy it because I was a poor student. It was like $15 or something, like 9.99 quid at the time. So I promised myself, like, you know, I'm gonna get it. I was graduating in '98 from university. I was like, I'm gonna get it for myself as a graduation gift, kind of thing. And then the day I graduated, a relative gave me like a 20 quid gift card for Waterstones. He was like, "Do you know what you're spending it on?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." So I rushed back and I got Infinite Jest and Supposedly Fun Thing. And I started with Supposedly Fun Thing, and then it kind of went from there. So then fast forward quite a few years, actually, like 2014. So I was back in Athens. I was working in a bookstore, and I was like, there wasn't much of Wallace translated into Greek at the time. There were a couple of things, but yeah, you know. So one of the things I did the moment they hired me was like just order loads of copies of Wallace in English and just start kind of flogging that. So I developed a bit of a reputation as a kind of like expert. And then I wrote a couple of things for like Greek literary magazines that were about Wallace, that were very long. And then ended up going to the Infinite Wallace conference in Paris to co-present a paper there. So by 2014, you know, I'd done a couple of translations, not Wallace, but like the difficult thing I'd done at that point was Jonathan Latham's Motherless Brooklyn. And then Wallace was being published slowly, but nobody wanted to touch Infinite Jest because, you know, it's Infinite Jest, right? And then, you know, basically if you work it out, like the way kind of publishing formats work here, by the time Infinite Jest is out, like the Greek edition is going to be something like 2,500 pages long. So yeah, nobody wanted to touch it until somebody wanted to touch it. It was suggested to the publisher who bought the rights, and the translator that suggested it to them was also offered the book. And he very graciously, and probably because he's a much saner man than me, kind of went, no, I'm not the guy for you, but I know who you should talk to. And he put us in touch. And they kind of went, oh, okay, you're that crazy, because like he told them also the guy I'm gonna suggest as the potential translator has the last sentence of Infinite Jest tattooed on his arm. So they were like, oh, that sounds like the man for the job. So yeah, like that was 10 years ago now. I mean, well, yeah, I actually said straight off it would take 5 years or so. And they said fine. It's just in the meantime, all sorts of stuff came up, and then I also ended up doing a PhD right in the middle of translating this thing because, you know, why not? So I'm about a month and a half to like 2 months away from turning it in. Should be out by the end of this year, and we'll see what happens.
The end of this year or the end of next year?
End of this year.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, well, when I say this year, I mean 2014, right? I mean, like, I'm thinking it's going to be due in like early February, and then, you know, I think like something like autumn 2014 should be out.
2024, you mean?
2014. Jeez. See, this is why I'm haunted by this thing at this point. I just have to be done with it.
Unless you have a time machine, maybe. Your story of discovering it is almost identical to mine, in that I went into a bookstore in 1997. They had a huge stack of paperbacks, and this is the copy. This is the one that I bought that day.
Here's mine.
So mine has survived all of those years, and I want to acknowledge too that we have you know, the pleasure of interacting with some other translators who could not be here today, and that Infinite Jest has been published. You know, the first translation was actually in Italian, and there are multiple other editions in the past 15 years that have been published in Brazilian Portuguese, in French, in Russian, in Hungarian, in Finnish, and Chinese, and Polish. So we have a lot of other opportunities to invite translators in to these kinds of discussions, but this is the first that, you know, I've wanted to have with people who have these kinds of discussions. And I should say the Brazilian Portuguese translators, including Caetano Galindo, was very instrumental in starting the email group that brought us sort of all together. And I find, you know, that group to be super interesting because it is so beneficial when someone is like Moeen was rapidly working to the end of the translation and had some very key critical questions of, you know, how would you translate this? And going back into 1998, 1999, when the Wallace L listserv was, you know, one of the only ways to find out about Wallace or to interact with other people who had read the book, one of the first real advantages of that email list was that translators could ask each other these kinds of questions, because often David Foster Wallace himself or his agent was not very responsive, or he didn't even do email until well into the 2000s. And so you had to mail a letter and hope that he wrote you back in a coherent way. And often these translators, you know, and I'm thinking here of some of the Russian and Finnish and Hungarian translators, they didn't have a network of Americans to ask about a lot of the slang stuff. They were relying on, you know, previously published details. And so I want to ask you guys about, you know, how did you work through some of those issues? Like some of you, like I say, Moeen came later. Ulrich, you know, when you had questions, let's start with you, or even Vasco, who worked on this 10 years ago, about how did you work out any things that you felt you had really trouble translating? How did you deal with those problems?
Vasco, you want to go first? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, sorry. Yeah, I guess it implied a lot of research. And since we were there were two of us, it was kind of very fruitful to have like discussions with my dad. And sometimes he would find a solution, and sometimes it was the other way around. But we didn't have really that much of a network, because I knew of Ulrich's translation, and I think it is the Italian one. I'm not sure if it came out in Spanish, because I used for the essays. I think I used I bought the Spanish translation, which is of course easy for us to understand. So that was quite helpful. But for Infinite Jest, it was really I always pictured it as like a puzzle. Each page was like a puzzle that you had to kind of try and sort it out, and with multiple levels, and trying to get at the end of the day it was almost like also a page a day, because it was so demanding. But yeah, and that's why we would really like to go back and maybe fix a few things, because I guess it could be improved a bit. And I think
Ulrich,
that's it.
go ahead. Yeah. Jump
No.
in there. Ulrich.
Okay, I think I had 3 columns of support. One was, as you mentioned before, Wallace listserv, which was a huge help for me, and you always answered my questions in next to no time. And I can see that Christopher Hammerer is here. I think he answered some of my questions. So hi to you, Christopher. We also have a very supportive network of colleagues in Germany. So when I didn't have special Wallace questions, but rather slang questions, drug questions, I could also ask more experienced colleagues translating from English for their help. And the third is, which is probably the case with my colleagues here as well, you go to experts. And so when I needed art history problem solved, I went to an art historian I knew from university. I asked my dad, who was a psychiatrist, whenever I had drug problems. No, I mean, I had translation problems with drugs. So he could help me out quite a bit with depression also. Yeah, I think that's it. These 3 groups of helpers.
In Igor or Costas or John Moeen, any of you want to add to that about figuring out slang and dialect issues, drugs, all that stuff?
Yeah, well, I would also say that there are a few lines of help for me too, and one of them obviously was this email group that we had, and it was just great to bounce back these ideas between us and discuss these things. And there are also a few friends from the US that helped me. It also helped that I was in Boston like 10 or so years ago. And there were, of course, my colleagues here who had maybe experience with certain things. And there were other, useful and helpful ways to find out about things. There was this interesting thing I had with this website that was about it's dedicated to helping addicts, and I kept checking things there. It's a Serbian website, but they have this like little support window. And after a while, somebody contacted me from that website, like, do you need help? Because they thought I was like looking around, for me to find some help, and I was actually just checking stuff there. So yeah, several lines of help, and I think I did the best I could. Yeah.
Yeah.
You wanna jump in, Moeen?
Yes. I would add, beside the mailing list, obviously, there were many online sources too, that maybe 2 decades ago were not. Infinite Wiki, or many slang websites, many websites for slang terms. And obviously the Greg's book, Elegance Complexity, helped me very, very well. And many colleagues, many Iranian colleagues, my essential question for them was, can you please tell me, does it work in Farsi too? I know it's work in English, but does it work in Farsi too? Because I had to make many changes syntax-wise. And I wasn't sure that it works in Farsi too. I was asking myself constantly that maybe I'm messing around with the syntax too much or too less. So kudos to them.
Yeah, go ahead, Costas, and then I have another follow-up question. Go ahead.
So but by the time I actually started the translation, like I'd already read the book. Like I think I was on my fourth read. I had a look today, and like when I started the translation, I was on my fourth read on page 140. And here's my second, and 994 in terms of the endnotes. So, and then I'd already collected pretty much all the criticism that was out there. And I was a member of Wallace, and I had Greg's book, which was very helpful and all that stuff. But also, like, because for better or for worse, I've been kind of steeped in American culture for like a very long time. And I've got like family in the States. So funnily enough, it wasn't like I didn't struggle so much with like the slang or anything. What I did struggle with a lot, interestingly, was a lot of the lingos, a lot of the professional lingos in the book, because Greek is kind of weird, because we're not, Greece is not a very technologically advanced country, right? We tend to kind of import all our technology. So we also tend to import all the lingo that comes with it. So you run into problems like you're trying to translate like, tennis stuff or like film stuff especially. And then you realize that, well, here's the thing though. When you're talking about like Greek cinema, right, a lot of the lingo just is used in English because that's what everybody understands. But then when you translate it for a kind of general audience, you can't just leave everything in English. You actually have to translate it somehow, but there's no translation a lot of the time. So that was actually the major struggle, to kind of figure out, because you can't like at a level where like even like the basic tennis stuff, like the Greek words for backspin and topspin are backspin and topspin. But like if you say that to anybody who doesn't play tennis or doesn't watch tennis in Greece, they're like, what are you even talking? Like they have no idea what you're talking about. So it was that kind of thing that was like the major issue. And then it became a question of just kind of just sitting there, like looking for like trawling the Greek internet, trying to find any kind of translation for anything, going to bookstores and looking at books, talking to fellow translators and kind of begging for help, and just kind of trying to do what I could with it. So yeah, I think that was the major thing actually. Weirdly, it was like just finding Greek equivalents for stuff that just doesn't have a Greek equivalent.
Well, and on that note, my next question for you all is if you can remember a specific word or phrase or passage that you're very proud of that you made work in English as well as, for the original as well as for your language you were translating it into. Is there something you recall that just happened to work very well or that you made work very well in translation? Like Igor, you mentioned the title was, it's a Hamlet reference. And so the fact that you made it work as a Hamlet reference in Serbian as well as in English, things like that. Is there anything that stands out to you that you're proud that you made work?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. I mean, the title was not difficult because this phrase was perfect, I just looked it up and I was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to use that. But the one thing, that comes to mind right now is to get demapped. I think I managed to, get the idea of it into Serbian without changing the word a lot itself, because there is a word that shares the root with map in Serbian. It's mapa. And from there, there is a verb as well. And then I also added this D prefix and so on. So I think that worked really well because it helped me a lot, because it kept this dynamic of the sentence alive in Serbian as well, where that word appeared. So that's one thing that I can remember now, for example.
I might as well jump in. So first of all, the title, I'm still working on that. Because slight problem, there's no exact translation for jest in Greek. And then I've gone and looked at every single available translation of Hamlet. And then the way it's been translated, nothing works as a book title. Just none of it works. So it was one of those things where about like 6 months into it, I was like, I'm just not going to bother. I'll just figure it out right at the end after the book is done. But the one bit I'm really proud of is it took me about 6 months to figure out how to translate onan in a way that actually still means onan in Greek. And the day I actually figured out how to do it, I was just so proud of myself. I was like, well, if nothing else, I got that right. That joke works, kind of thing. Also, side note, the one thing in this book that's still not translated is I'm still trying to figure out how to translate the Howling Phantods in a way that kind of like more or less works for every repetition of the word phantods in the book. So again, it was one of those things where I was like, I'm just going to finish the whole thing. And then I've got a list of every occurrence of phantods in the book. And then I'll just take one last look at them and just go with something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just proud of myself for making onan work. That's just it.
Yeah, I have to jump in here because I'm also very proud of what I did in Serbian with onan, and yeah, it just stayed the same, and it means what it should mean. That's it. Yeah, but it took me a while. It took me a while.
And to follow up on that for the rest of you too, was there anything that you felt like is truly untranslatable, or that you just could not solve in a way that was to your satisfaction, or that you felt was confusing in the original and in the translation?
Excuse me, you mean apart from the first 981 pages that are intranslatable, or what?
Yeah,
No,
apart
just
from
to get
all
your
of that,
question clear.
apart from, well, there was no
Okay,
scribbles,
okay.
right? Yeah.
Just wanted to make that clear.
In our little group of the email list, you know, the one thing that stands out to me was about 2 years ago when Moeen brought us this question about boot 8.8. And I want to read that passage for everyone because when he brought it to us, I thought, you know, I'm a native English speaker. I should know what the fuck this says. And I had trouble parsing it in English. And then you add the complexities of 9 other languages on top of that. I don't know how you make sense of that in a translation. So for the people at home, this is on page 129 in one of those Yours Truly chapters. And it says, but also at this time, we come up and run into Keely Vinoy that was working her corner by the dumpster, by Cheapo Records, in the square, by the email place. And she's dope sick having a conversation with Equus and another man. And Equus said he said Stokely Darkstar just got free tested again at the Fenway and confirmed a big boot 8.8. He's got the virus for sure. And Purple Boy said Darkstar said how if he was going down, he didn't give a shit, blah, 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 blah. This goes on. And that sort of, you know, we thought was drug slang. He boot 8.8. What the hell? And so this is an example of something of a neologism, I would say, not to be taken entirely literally. Obviously, a lot of non-standard syntax. And, you know, I wanted to ask you all, like, what were some of the complexities of your language that, you know, an English speaker who wrote something like that probably wouldn't understand?
I'm gonna jump in. Two specific topic comes to my mind. One is that Farsi is basically a verb fixed language, and the verb comes at the end of the sentence. So it's very challenging to translate long sentences because Wallace's sentences tend to be continuing endlessly, and the main problem for me was that where the hell should I put the verb? You know, I can't put the verb at the end of the sentence because the whole meaning is delivered in the beginning of the sentence. So I got back to many previous translations, like In Search of Lost Times, Proust, Joyce's, and many traditional poetic Farsi text, Iranian text, and also the natural slang of Iranian, the way Iranian talk and the way they mix up the syntax. It was a headache. It was really a headache. And the other thing that I can remember was the year 30 chapter, because I wanted to use slang, obviously. I wanted to use dope addict slang, but I don't want to make it somehow set in Tehran, set in downtown in Tehran, somewhere in Tehran that dope addicts live. I wanted to be in Boston, and it was a headache because you have to balance it right. You know, you have to use the slangs in Persian, but you have to use it properly and not push it too far. And somehow you have to make a new language, a new system of language that works.
I can jump in here too. Like Turkish, like a bit similar to Farsi. It's like subject, object, verb, and like if you say like I love you in Turkish, you say you love basically. And the way David Foster Wallace uses all these like conjunctions and like these like semi-clauses and like these like long sentences. And like in Turkish, you have to make sure that there is not too much like distance between subject and the verb, because then it's really hard to carry on like a, let's say, like a meaningful meaning. And so like that was like one of the biggest problems, and it still is the biggest problems for me, especially when I like reach around, I think like 800, like 780 is like 850 pages. So generally, that is one part of the problem. And the other is Turkish is an agglutinative language. It works with like all these like suffixes, like these morphemes. And like if you say, for example, you can just say it almost in one word, I wonder whether they are at home or not. You can just say like evdeler miymiş, which is just like basically one word. So this is like when you're like trying to translate it, you are trying to make sure that every like Wallace's style is preserved in Turkish without making it sound like gibberish or pretentious, like this like too translated Turkish.
If I can just jump back in with that. So Greek, kind of a nightmare. So yeah, the yours truly sections, I have no idea like what I've done. We'll find out. That doesn't, like, it's one of those things. Greek doesn't quite have that kind of lingo, I guess. But also something like the Wardine section is a complete nightmare. Because you know whether or not the eubonics in that are like good, it's still the case that in Greek we don't really have anything similar to eubonics. What we have is some very like location specific kind of like sub dialects that you cannot use when you translate, because they're very recognizably from some very specific part of like Greece. So you're like, you can't put that in a translation and put it in the mouth of somebody who lives in Boston. That just looks dumb. But then there's also stuff like, you know, Greek is like highly inflected. So that creates a hell of a problem when you've got like very long subordinate sentences. And then from like you go from clause to clause, and like you get nouns that have to be in the nominative, but then they have to be in the genitive. And then Greek is kind of weird because languages, like words borrowed from other languages, you don't really find them in the genitive because it just sounds terrible. So then you have to figure out some way to kind of flip the syntax of like a particular clause, but not flip the syntax of the entire sentence. And then it just kind of cascades into this horrible, horrible nightmare of like, what on earth am I doing here?
I guess I would say that Portuguese is kind of a bit of a mixture from what I've been hearing, because we have similar problems. First of all, it's really less flexible. It's not comparable to English, and you don't have as much a vocabulary as you have in English. And also the thing with the noun and the verb, they should also be close to each other. So it's with all those long rambling sentences, and you kind of have to subdivide it also, and always try to find the right equilibrium, knowing that you want to be as much as faithful as possible to what Wallace wrote, but always keeping in mind that you're translating to a different language with different set of rules. And so that was quite a tricky proposition, and also the neologisms were quite a bit of a headache, and the things with is misspelling French words. How should you proceed? Should you do it? Should you leave it in French? Should you do like footnotes in a book that has like hundreds of endnotes and footnotes to endnotes? So it's I think those were the main issues in Portuguese wise. And regarding the title, I think we were also proud of the title, because also Jest isn't really a word that has like there's a specific word for it in Portuguese. And if Caetano was here, it would be fun, because he did it another way, and we also had that option. Ours is called Piada Infinita. Piada is like more of a joke. And Caetano's case, he did Graça Infinita, which is also something could be funny, but like grace, it has like at least like a spiritual kind of touch to it. So we were trying to figure out just the title was like a bit of a nightmare. And then of course you had, when it came out, you had lots of people just bringing us down because we chose piada and not another word. So yeah, that's it.
And Ulrich, why don't you answer that as well?
I have a nice facet to add. We had problems with Randy Lance's malapropisms, because sometimes they are very slight mistakes, and it's not really for the German reader to understand or misunderstand, but I was afraid that my copy editors would correct things that I translated or wrote down wrongly on purpose. So in the end, I wrote down a long list that writing ammonymous instead of anonymous, and things like, or aqualine instead of aquiline, were on purpose. That's very nice on a microscopic level. Fortunately, I didn't get any Amazon reviews, because they would have probably criticized the publisher for editing a completely misspelled book.
And I should say David Foster Wallace himself had that same issue with copy editors trying to fix his mistakes. And his sort of standard line was, at the beginning of every manuscript, he'd put an NB, nota bene, saying all non-standard syntax is intentional and should be steaded. And so that wouldn't stop the copy editors often from fixing it, but he worked very hard to keep those in there. And, another one, kind of going off of Hannah's question there about malapropisms and the characters' voices, is, something like cirrhosis of the liver. That works very well in English as the double meaning, but those double meanings, which do you choose? Do you try to make it as literal, or to try to make it work in your language, even if that means changing the original?
I could, may I jump in again? I could actually keep it. I just had to cirrhosis of the liver is a knight. The German word for cirrhosis of the liver or liver cirrhosis is Leberzirrhose, and I could very slightly move the sound of Leberzirrhose to Liebherr-Zirrhose, which is not a knight anymore, but a troubadour. It's a singer, at King Arthur's court. So I had to very slightly change the sentence of the meaning of one or two sentences to get this Liebherr-Zirrhose instead of Leberzirrhose over in German. But I think that was actually one of my star minutes during the translation when I think I found a pun that really works in German.
That's great. Go ahead, Kostas.
Yeah, I'd say, well, so there's stuff that I kind of went for. I'm not going to go for the literal meaning, but I'm going to try and kind of replicate the effect. And that was fine. But then there was also stuff where I was like, well, I have to kind of replicate both the effect and the meaning because it's kind of crucial to the book. So like Onan, you can't just like leave it as Onan. You have to do something with it, but then it also has to kind of make sense in the context of the book. And those were kind of like the big nightmares where all of a sudden, like Randy Lentz's malapropisms, it was like, okay, I can like, if something really doesn't work in Greek, because some of it just didn't work in Greek, I can always like find, like, let's say that there's like a paragraph where there's like 2 or 3 of those. I can, if one of them doesn't work, I can replace it with something else in the same paragraph. It's fine, as long as like kind of the overall effect is more or less the same. But to be honest, because I translated Motherless Brooklyn before that, and Motherless Brooklyn, I don't know if people have read it, is an even worse nightmare in that sense, because, you know, the main character has Tourette's, so he's constantly spouting gibberish. Only thing is, it's not really gibberish. About half of it is actually really crucial to the plot of the book, so don't even ask. But I'd say with Jest is one of the weird things was like Randy Lentz's malapropisms were a problem, right? What I found strangely that wasn't a problem at all was Remy Marat's broken English, which for some reason it just works like a charm in Greek. It's very, very easy to do. I don't know why, or maybe I'm just fooling myself, and by the time people read it, they'll be like, "What were you talking about?" But I think. I don't know. I think especially with Greek also because you're kind of moving away from like the Latin alphabet. A lot of the stuff is just very, very difficult to do. Also because of the way the language works and the way that it's kind of hard to mishear things in the way that it's easy to mishear things in English. So I literally remember the whole bit about Remy being told about the live-in staff at Ennet House, and he hears live-in staff as living staff. Like that, there's like absolutely no way you can do that in Greek. So you try kind of to do what you can, and to be honest, there are like a few instances where after about 2 hours of me just staring at one word, I went, yeah, I can't do this particular thing. Let's just move on now. I'll just kind of, you know, I'll replicate the meaning, but not the effect.
That's really, I think that's really valuable for the reader. And my last question for you all is we're actually going to try to keep this around a 1 hour forum today, is a question that Milena alludes to in the chat, which is about Wallace's reputation or reception in your country. I think, you know, for me as an American reader, you know, of Wallace there in 1997, going back to those old days when the book first came out, I had no idea, you know, that he would end up at his reputation where he is now. And so I remember talking with some of his Italian translators, and Wallace was very popular and hip and cool in Italy in the late 1990s, the same way that he was in Brooklyn, for example. But his reception in other countries has been very different, in some cases very minor and under the radar. In some other cases, you know, all of his works have been translated. There's been big theater productions. There's been a lot of attention on his work pretty much after his death, and that who really only got popular after, or well known after his death. So I wanted to ask you that question. You know, how does, you know, Wallace, what is his reputation like, or not? And, you know, how does that generally fit within the sort of body of national literature or translated literature in your country? Whoever wants to take that.
In Turkey, the first Wallace was published was like This Is Water, and then like of course like everywhere people like loved it, but then they realized that like there's this book called Infinite Jest, and Elif Shafak, this kind of like famous Turkish writer, like she wrote both in Turkish and in English, and like she got translated back to Turkish. She wrote an article on Wallace, kind of like an obituary when he passed away, and then like in the literary circles people start to talk about him. But this was kind of like in Turkey, there's a strange thing that like there's like thing called like underground literature, like Jack Kerouac, like Hubert Selby Jr., like stuff like, and there's like this like postmodernist look to the American literature. This kind of gets conflated sometimes. Like there's these like hard books, these like really like hard to get into books, and people are like curious about them. They look at them like they're like artifacts. So there are like lots of people who are waiting for David Foster Wallace to get like the Infinite Jest to get published. But I wouldn't say that like it has kind of like this like major effect, and there's a danger that it could be this book like when Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose came out in 1990s in Turkey. It was kind of like a sine qua non, like to have it at your house, and Infinite Jest could be a bit like that. Maybe there's like this danger.
Yeah, if I can, I would say that Infinite Jest, it really fits well on your bookshelf. So it's something that a lot of people want to have, but I'm not sure, at least here in Portugal, most of them have read it. So I don't think there's like, because it was strange here that we started publishing Foster Wallace. Infinite Jest was the first one, so it's really strange for me. It would be much easier and comprehensible to start with the essays, for instance. But since we started with Infinite Jest, with like the highest mountain to climb, it was really a big thing then. There was really hyped, and there was like a really big, lots of big promotional stuff for it. And but then it kind of fizzled out fast. I think the bubble burst really quickly, and I'm not sure if the essays or Pale King, they weren't as well received, at least in terms of sales. Of course, he's very highly regarded in terms of literary criticism, but I think he's still like a fringe author here in Portugal. And you can't really say, of course, because of all the differences in terms of languages, Portuguese and English, there's not really like a school of David Foster Wallace literature here in Portugal. So I think, and there's still quite a few things to be published, and I guess they just lost interest in it.
The German situation is that I think a supposedly fun thing, I'll Never Do Again, came out first and became a bestseller. So the first thing people knew about Wallace was, they read him. People read him as a very comic, very funny author, because a supposedly fun thing is, of course, very funny, and that completely changed after his suicide. So the strange thing is that I started the translation of Infinite Jest in 2003, I think, maybe 2004, and I had almost finished it at the end of 2008. And for me, it had been, I read the book and I translated the book as the book of an author who, yes, had suffered from depression, but had in the end overcome it. So the book for me was full of comfort, consolation. And it wasn't for German readers, because the German translation only came out a year after his suicide. So they read it as the novel, as the document of an author who had succumbed to his depression, who had not survived, who had lost the fight against it. And actually, I think I told you this, Moeen, in the video you asked us for. It was I therefore sometimes misreacted in public readings, because I selected funny passages from the book. And at one reading, a woman came to me afterwards and said, why do you why did you introduce, or why did you show us Infinite Jest as a comic book? It's a deeply depressive book. So I had a completely different reception from everybody else in Germany who read the novel after his suicide. And apart from that, just adding up on what Vasco just said, I think all of Wallace's works have been translated into German over a long period of time. I think they started in 98, maybe even earlier with the stories and a supposedly fun thing. And I only translated the essays, I think 6 or 7 years ago. So over a period of almost 20 years, all of his works have been translated and published.
And yours is one of the few that also has an audiobook. Is that right?
Yes, right. But that was a collective experiment because the audiobook has been produced by lay readers. You could sign up on a website and subscribe to read a single page of the book.
That's really cool. I like
So
that.
the audiobook is the collaborative production of 1,550 people.
I think that's great. It's almost like a Wikipedia page. Anyone can do it.
It's a lovely idea. I loved it.
When we started the David Foster Wallace Society and the journal, we were very intentional about putting the word international in there, because from the beginning, when we had conferences, Greg was at the first one ever in 2009 in Liverpool. There's always been an interest outside of the US in David Foster Wallace. And it's felt like for a long time that our potential in bringing in new readers is really in new languages. And so it's exciting for us to know that, people in China or in Italy, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Turkey, and Iran will have the chance, to read what we think is, one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. So that to us is a new frontier. And I want to say we're going to, not have time to get to everyone's questions today, but we would like to do this again. Like I say, when we can bring in even more translators, and I know like Jarek is here who worked on the Polish translation and editing, and you mentioned, Greg Carlisle's book mentioned a couple of times. So we have plenty of opportunity for more conversations. We hope that you will all join us again in the future. And I personally love it that this is a book that, I've been talking about with many of the people here on this Zoom call for 25 years or more. So that's pretty neat that there's still a lot to talk about, like so much so that we are not going to be able to get everyone's questions answered here today. So I want to go around and ask the translators for if they have any final thoughts before we close, and then we'll stop the recording.
I'm gonna just say that, there's like moloprisms, the hard syntax and everything. But apart from that, like David Foster Wallace does these like little weird things that are kind of like hard to convey. It's kind of like points to the artifacts of the language most of the time by doing like small tricks. Like for example, like really simple example, he doesn't say people sitting in the bleachers. He says bleachers people. And like in Turkish, it like when you translate this, it creates such a weird effect. For example, when you tribünlerdeki insanlar is one thing to say, like the people in the bleachers. When you say like tribünlerin insanları, it means something like people created by the bleachers or something. So like it kind of like fits really interestingly. So yeah, like it's kind of like interesting to talk about all these like other words, but like the small things he does is kind of like permeates the whole structure of the novel, which I find really interesting when you translate. So yeah, it's kind of like a hard balance to keep. Thanks.
I'm gonna go back to your question, Matt, about the censorship of the book, and because it's a kind of a fun and sad story. And we know that the previous government 2 years ago was going to leave, and the office and the new government will come out. So I had to do it in 18 months before they leave. and before the more conservative government comes in. So I did it. I did it in, I think, 16 months, the first draft, and we sent the whole book to the office, hoping that they don't bother to read it. It was, I think, 1,500 pages of the book, and they get paid for reading, and they didn't bother to read such a complex book to find some sensitive words and some sensitive scenes, and they just Control-F it to find some fuck sex and things like that. And we changed the words slightly to avoid this kind of Control-F findings, and we get away with it.
All right, great. Let's end it on that note. Thank you all again. I appreciate our translators. Give them a round of applause. Thank you for joining us today. Everyone in the audience as well, thank you so much for showing up. Sorry we didn't have time to get to all of your questions, but we pledge to do this again. And like I say, to bring in some other translators and to also have more of our society meetings open to members of the society like this on Zoom. I also have to put in a plug for our issue number 4 of our journal, which is out, which I'm really happy about. So members will be receiving that, and this recording will be posted on the website dfwsociety.org. So please do check back there later. And thank you all for being here today.